Welcome to yet another in the series of Perth US Asia Center Foreign Policy Conversations. Today, we're delighted to be joined by one of the real giants of Australian foreign policy, someone who really needs no introduction to our audience. Alexander Downer is the former Australian High Commissioner to London, most recently. Prior to that, he was our longest serving foreign minister from 1996 all the way through 2007, served 20 years in Australia's parliament, had previously been leader of the opposition, and currently is serving as executive chair of the International Relations School, or rather the International School for Government at King's College in London. And we're delighted that Alexander, you're kind enough to get up early in the morning in London to kind of share your insights with us. I have to confess that in the 25 years that I was in Washington, D.C., a good chunk of that was while you were foreign minister. And so I was the frequent beneficiary of the speeches that you gave in Washington, D.C. And now I'm delighted to share some different questions from the exact opposite point on the planet in Perth, Australia. So thank you again for joining us.
It's a great pleasure, Gordon. Very happy to do it.
Now, the attention of the Australian foreign policy community has been focused on London, or a little bit south in Cornwall. You may have known that just over 2 weeks ago, our Prime Minister Scott Morrison, on his way to the G7, kindly stopped by Perth. We think it's the appropriate place to give a speech looking at the Indo-Pacific era, and gave a wonderful foreign policy speech focusing on values, Australia's strategies, interests in the region writ large. Interestingly, using the term liberal in terms of liberal economics and liberal society and liberal rules-based order some 19 times during the course of that speech. I wonder if we might just kind of start there, how Australia's policy is viewed internationally, how it's being viewed from London, and any particular observations you might have had about Prime Minister Morrison's most recent speech on foreign policy.
Well, I thought it was a timely and appropriate speech, and it struck a good balance. It first and foremost recognises that the most important geopolitical issue in the world today is the rise of China and how that's going to be managed. History is replete with stories of the rise of new great powers and the challenge of those powers to status quo powers. So, you know, sometimes referred to in Graham Allison's formulation as the Thucydides trap. And I think there's a lot to that theory. There's no doubt about it. It's a good analysis of history. So Australia has found itself in quite a central role in all of that, perhaps not very deliberately, but it's ended up there. I mean, clearly Australia has huge trading relationships with China, but over and above that, the way China has turned on Australia has tried to use sanctions to pull Australia into line, to use Australia or its dealings with Australia as a way of setting an example to other countries that they should tremble and obey. Australia will find it tough to deal with that situation on its own. That was the calculation they made in Beijing. And therefore, Australia needs to turn to its friends and allies and its counterparts, if you like, in the liberal democratic world. What we sometimes call the Western world, although countries like Japan, South Korea, and Australia obviously are physically Western. And work together with those countries and demonstrate something else to China. And that is that the liberal democratic world will, when push comes to shove, concentrate together, come together. And they have fractured in their relations with China over quite some years. In fact, you know, all the time I was foreign minister, there were tensions between different Western countries over how to manage the relationship with China, as there are over managing the relationship with Russia as well. But what China has done, including through its treatment of Australia, is draw all these countries together. And so Scott Morrison, I think, has quite rightly laid out the ground there. And the ground is that liberal democratic countries in the teeth of challenge from authoritarian states need to uphold the international system that has been created since the Second World War the rule of international law, and the liberal democratic model of human society. And the speech was timely because he is on his way to the G7 summit, and at the G7 summit, that was, if not for the media, the central message was the underlying message of what that meeting was about.
Well, that's actually a perfect segue to my second question is, I realize that you were in London, not in Cornwall, but I'm sure that you've had many conversations surrounding the G7 summit itself. I wonder if you might give us your assessment of the summit, its outcome, and perhaps given the fact that the one party that's changed the most since the last G7 meeting is the United States. Get a little bit of assessment in terms of how Joe Biden performed in this venue in contrast to his predecessor.
Well, I mean, first of all, the perspective from the UK was about issues that are germane to British foreign policy at the moment. So there was as much a focus in the UK on some dispute there is between the UK and the EU over what's called the Northern Ireland Protocol. I don't think I will bore people by going through all of that, but it's a dispute over trade from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, born out of the Brexit agreement that the UK struck with the EU. So in terms, particularly in terms of media coverage, there was a lot of focus on differences between the EU and the UK on that. And then the decision on the rollout of 1 billion vaccines to developing countries that, of course, you don't need a summit to make an announcement like that, but was an announceable for the summit. So that got quite a heavy focus, as well as what we've been talking about, how to manage China and the fact that they came together. Joe Biden, well, of course, in the case of Donald Trump, he was so unpredictable. I mean, much more with his, not so much his policies, but his public statements. So Joe Biden is much more downbeat. I mean, you know, Donald Trump got Joe Biden elected, not the genius of Joe Biden, let's be honest. He comes across as very old, actually. That's how he comes across. Not a very dynamic sort of president, but friendly enough, you know, friendly. So that was a very different atmosphere from the atmosphere which would have been the previous G7 meeting, which I think was in France. It was in Deauville or Biarritz, I think.
Indeed.
You know, I can't remember too much in the way of details from that summit because it was a while ago. But so much of it would have revolved around comments that Trump made and comments other people made about Trump. So you didn't really have any of that. You know, Joe Biden went through his motion, read his cards, stuck to his talking points, and didn't say anything particularly controversial or unpredictable. And to be honest with you, if you're dealing with the United States and you're Great Britain or you're Germany or Japan or whoever you are, you're Australia or India, it makes for an easier life if the President of the United States is going to be predictable. You know, the thing that, as I say, the thing about Joe Biden is he got elected because of Donald Trump, and people just wanted to get American voters, like the rest of the world, wanted Donald Trump to disappear from the White House, regardless of who, within reason, I suppose, regardless of who replaced him. And Joe Biden did the business. What he'll be like now, well, you know, as I say, he's predictable. He doesn't appear dangerous. He doesn't frighten anybody. He sticks to his cards and his talking points, and people like Jake Sullivan and so on are really the brains behind the operation.
It is certainly strange to live in a world where comments like predictable are the highest possible compliments you can be giving in the world. But
to be brutal, he does come across as sort of fragile and elderly. and it might be unfair to say that, but it's just a reality. And you know, you're sitting watching. I didn't watch him give a press conference. We've hardly ever does press conferences, but I did watch him give a press conference in Geneva after his meeting with President Putin, and I realized I was sitting on the edge of my chair, somewhere in my subconscious, thinking, "Gosh, I hope he gets through this okay."
Yeah, it's all the more humbling for me because he does keep up a pace that I don't know that I would be able to keep up with. And that's tough regardless of whether you're in your 70s, 80s, or your 50s in that regard. Hey, your comments on trade obviously made me think about another one of the highlights from an Australian perspective of Prime Minister Morrison's trip to the G7, and that was the announcement of an Australia-UK free trade agreement. Obviously, this is something that we had in different formats before, but with the Brexit, it's become new again. I wonder if you might share your insights with us on the agreement itself, and then really how important that is from an Australian perspective.
Well, first of all, it's symbolically important because it rebuilds an old bond with the UK. Now, the UK has left the European Union and is able to negotiate agreements like this. When I was a child, the UK must have been Australia's largest trading partner from recollection, possibly Japan, but I think actually, no, I think it would have been the UK. And I lived through the UK joining the EEC, as it was then called, because my father was the Australian High Commissioner to the UK in the lead up to the UK joining the EEC. So through all the negotiations, which included negotiations with Australia, very unsuccessful negotiations from Australia's point of view, which led to a lot of our agricultural exports being either substantially reduced or more or less banned from the market that had been their biggest market. So it had a huge negative impact at the time in the early 1970s. So all of that, is a long time ago, and the world has changed a lot since then. But in those years since 1973, British foreign policy has been very much focused on Europe. I've often pointed out in all of those years, something like 70% of all overseas visits by British foreign ministers, not just the foreign secretary, but by the other ministers in the portfolio, in the Foreign Office portfolio, something like 70% of all of their overseas visits had been to EU countries. So country like Australia has been very marginal to British foreign policy since it joined the EEC. So what you're seeing is a big change now in British foreign policy. The UK is reactivating its old and traditional relationships in a more constructive and a more aggressive way. And Australia is front and center of that. They produced a foreign policy, we might call it a foreign and security policy document a couple of months ago called the Integrated Review. And the Integrated Review, amongst other things, talked about a tilt to the Indo-Pacific in British foreign policy. So this is an important component of that tilt to the Indo-Pacific. As for the agreement itself, it's one of the highest quality trade agreements Australia's ever negotiated. I mean, the highest quality agreement, that is the freest free trade agreement, is with New Zealand. And that was negotiated a very, very long time ago by the Fraser government. So this agreement provides for pretty much free trade in goods and pretty much free trade in services, and improvement in people-to-people movements should the Australian government ever allow, and the Australian people ever allow people to travel in and out of Australia again, since it's predicated on the basis that COVID first has to be eliminated worldwide, and bearing in mind that will never happen, not in the lifetimes of anybody who's alive today. I think you can you can question whether Australia will ever have people-to-people movements with other parts of the world again. But in any case, if you assume that it will have one day, then there's an improvement in the visa arrangements in this agreement. And in an area like agricultural trade, the quotas have been converted into tariff-free quotas, where, for example, the beef quota at the moment has a 20% tariff. And the actual level of the quotas has been increased very substantially, so substantially that we would never be able to fill those quotas. So there's a 10 and 15-year time lag before there is completely free trade in agriculture. But we would never fill the quotas. So in reality, it is pretty much a completely free trade agreement, which does demonstrate something very interesting about the UK's approach to international trade, which is in stark contrast to the EU, and that is that the UK is resuming a position that it had in the 19th century of being the champion of free trade.
Well, that's actually a perfect transition point to my next question. And it plays on several themes we've already been talking about, Australian support for the rules-based order and questions of predictability. One of the most unpredictable things I think that happened early on in the Trump administration was the decision on the part of President Trump on, I think, the first day he was in office, to withdraw the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And from my perspective, one of the most unanticipated and yet positive developments over the last 5 years was the leadership of Australia and Japan in particular in resurrecting that agreement in the forms of the comprehensive and progressive agreement of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. It was one of those weird moments where both Japan and Australia had done something that nobody thought they could do. It was really significant in holding the line in terms of our principles on free trade. And yet we couldn't celebrate that because to do so might draw the attention of the occupant of the White House at the time. And so it was kind of like, yay, TPP, but we really couldn't talk about it much. And now here we are. The UK has applied for admission to the CPTPP. That seems to be something that's akin to that tilt towards the Indo-Pacific that you're referring to. Could you give us a sense for the level of seriousness out of the UK on this front and what it might mean in relation to what you were just saying? The UK is returning to its traditional role as being kind of a leader of free trade in the world.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I thought it was one of the worst decisions. Some of their decisions were good, but I thought that was one of the worst decisions of the Trump administration to pull out of the TPP. Became renamed the CPTPP because Justin Trudeau insisted on it. When there was as a result of the review that there had to be of the TPP because of the United States withdrawal. Anyway, one of the conditions that Canada agreeing was exactly that, that the name be changed. Anyway, that was by the by. But however, had Hillary Clinton won that election, the result would have been the same because she was committed to pulling out of the TPP as well. So, and sadly, Joe Biden is showing no signs of rejoining the CPTPP. Well, honestly, what a name. So why don't they just call it the TPP? What about the UK? The UK is very keen to join it. And you read here in London from time to time reference to the fact that the UK has begun negotiations. Well, it's not a negotiation. They either join it or they don't. I mean, I think our attitude to that would be that they would be very welcome to join it. It'd be great to have them in it. I think they will. And as you quite rightly say, this is part of their tilt to the Indo-Pacific. That's one of the things we should be saying to the Biden administration. Australia should be saying, to the Biden administration, well, it will take you quite a lot of political capital to negotiate a free trade agreement, bilateral free trade agreement with the UK. But if you join the CPTPP, then that will be an easier way of concluding what will in effect be such an agreement with the UK. And there's more incentive for the Americans because the British economy, I'm not sure how accurate these figures are post-COVID, but the British economy is said to be the 5th biggest economy in the world. The Japanese economy is the 3rd biggest economy in the world. So from the American point of view, not being in the CPTPP is a little bit of a disadvantage for them commercially.
Well, and the primary reason, of course, remains that this is the rule-setting body for what we hope will be the rules-based order and how you organize economic interactions in this region. My colleague, Dr. Jeffrey Wilson, and I have written an op-ed in Korean for the Korean newspapers arguing that Korea should take advantage of the UK's bid to join as well, because again, the more in there, the more pressure that puts on the United States to join, the more significant it becomes. But like many, they remain very much focused on what Washington will do. And the answer, I think you put your finger on it, at least for this year, is not much on that front. Let me take a step back.
Well, yeah. Although to be fair, thinking about people I've spoken to in the Biden administration, and particularly before the election, thinking of people like Jake Sullivan, I think they can see the geopolitical advantage of joining the CPTPP, and so I think intellectually, within the administration, within the foreign policy establishment of the Biden administration, there would be a lot of support for rejoining it. But the question is, how do the politics stack up? And then we could rejoin it, and then they couldn't get the agreement through the Senate. And, you can imagine it would be a bit difficult. You've got the populist Republicans and the left of the Democratic Party. That seems to me to be a very natural coalition against free trade.
And you might imagine that the Biden administration does have a lot of other things on its plate right now in terms of COVID, getting an infrastructure package through, and then obviously the deep and ongoing divide of politics there, and issues. And
then they will have to deal with the economy later on when they've spent their $6 trillion. And as inflation is already ratcheted up to 5%, and when interest rates start to rise again, market interest rates, whatever the Fed does, when market interest rates start to rise again, they'll have to deal with the fallout from that, and they won't have any more fiscal bandwidth because they'll have spent all the money. I mean, I'm quite pessimistic about it. That's not part of the narrative of the era. People don't talk about that. It just seems great that he's spending all this money on infrastructure and bridges need building and so on. Well, everyone would do it the whole time, wouldn't they? If you didn't have to worry about where the money came from. Nobody's against building bridges and improving the freeways and whatever it is, a green economy, and it's fine as long as you can make the maths work. And I'm terribly worried about, it's not going to happen in the next year, but I'm terribly worried over the next 4 or 5 years about what is going to happen to the American economy, because they're just not doing the maths. And when I heard the, I'm sorry, I don't remember her name, but the woman who is the head of the Council of Economic Advisors on the radio yesterday morning talking about this issue, she was being asked this sort of questions that I'm raising now by the BBC. She seemed very uncertain and unconvincing in her answers, frankly. So yeah, the CPTPP, well, that's part of free trade and economic rationalism, making sure your budgets are manageable, and all of these kind of boring questions, which have just gone out the window in current public debate in Western countries. And the price of doing that is just going to be huge. It's just going to be huge.
Well, you're right to be focusing on the long term. And if I could bring around one final question, back to this notion of the UK tilt towards the Indo-Pacific. You know, the Indo-Pacific as a construct itself is really about the long term, right? It's about that shifting economic center of gravity in our region. So from your era, our intense focus on the Asia-Pacific, but recognizing the growing importance of India, hoping to integrate India into the architecture and the systems of the Asia-Pacific. So the Indo-Pacific is something that has been central to Australian foreign policy. Our most recent foreign policy white paper that your successor, Julie Bishop, put out in November of 2017 used Indo-Pacific as kind of the organizing construct for how we look at the world. And it seems that a lot of other countries in the world agree, not just the United States, but the Germany, the Netherlands, France, all have Indo-Pacific strategies, as does the UK. So I wonder if you might give a sense of what you see to be the UK's role in the Indo-Pacific, or more broadly, the Indo-Pacific era.
Yeah, it's somewhat debated in the UK, and you know, they dwell on the question, at least commentators, academics, the media dwell on the question of how many resources is the UK going to deploy to the Indo-Pacific when it has priorities in the Atlantic and Europe, and it's a fair question. So why would they be interested in the first place? They're interested because partly for economic reasons, partly because of the move in economic weight and geopolitical weight in this world towards the Indo-Pacific and away from the Atlantic. So that is well recognized in the UK, and personally I think they're completely right to make that calculation. So that is at least part of that is about economics. They can see trade and investment opportunities in that part of the world growing faster than they will be growing in other parts of the world. Secondly, I think they perceive themselves as a global power. I mean, the UK is the 5th biggest economy in the world. The UK is a permanent member, one of 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, which brings with it global, not just regional responsibilities. It's a nuclear weapons state, which, I mean, I've often argued is more of a status symbol than anything particularly practical. But it is a nuclear weapons state. That gives it a seat at a whole lot of different tables. And it's a country which has more soft power, I suppose, than any other country in the world, with the possible exception of the United States. And actually, I think in the last 10 years, maybe a bit more than that, 15 or 20 years, the United States soft power has very substantially declined in the world. Its influence has diminished. The respect there is for the United States has declined. I mean, in the periods, there's no relationship to it, but in the period since I was a foreign minister, I think the standing of the United States in the world has substantially declined. And you touched on it. I think part of the childish partisanship that Americans indulge in may be all very well within the United States. Whatever 350 million people, whatever national conversations they want to have, they're welcome to have them, and they're going to have them anyway, whatever we think as outsiders. But when you're dealing with Americans, they've always got a partisan point to make, which is, you know, imagine every time you spoke to an Australian policymaker, they're always telling you that they hate the Liberal Party or they hate the Labor Party, and everything the Labor Party does or the Liberal Party does is wrong. I mean, honestly, it just does the United States so much damage, that. And then the sort of spread of, which is an illustration of soft power, of course, but the spread of this, what's nowadays sometimes called woke ideas, this sort of political correct. I mean, with mainstream societies in Europe and Australia and so on, people just look, roll their eyes. And I don't wish to say very much about it, but it just looks, it just looks also sort of slightly pathetic. I think this has had a real impact on America's these things, quite apart from Donald Trump and people thinking that, God, out of 350 million people, the Americans elect a guy who's so sort of wildly over the top like that. Then they elect a 78-year-old who's shuffling his cards and trying to remember what he has to say. And then this is weakening America's position in the world. I think it's very sorry. I'm very sorry to see it, and I'm very sad to see it. By the way, I don't like it at all. And then there's the UK. Well, the UK does have a lot of soft power. There's no doubt about that. And a lot of influence, networks, the like of which almost no other country on earth has, as a legacy of its empire and its links with the Commonwealth. There are all sorts of ways of articulating this through the common law system, parliamentary systems, the use of the English language, quite a long list of different things that you can go through, which illustrate the power of the UK in the world, the soft power of the UK in the world. So I think they sort of become more conscious of that, and they decided to exercise that perhaps a little bit more than they did before. So they're moving away from focusing so heavily on European issues to making sure that they become, or they re-become, come again as a sort of significant, a major player in world affairs, and they're competent enough to believe that their point of view and their values are going to be helpful to the world. So what is the most important single geopolitical issue in the world? It's the rise of China. So the UK needs to have something to say about that. And you touched on it. In the context of the rise of China, there's obviously a major effort made to draw India in as part of what you might describe in 19th century terms as the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region. We use the term Indo-Pacific very deliberately. And the UK, of course, has such a historic relationship with India. They still know India very well. I mean, you've got, and the foremost senior politicians in the UK, two of them are of Indian heritage. So, there are links and emotional ties and so on with India, more so than with China. They are using that.
Well, Alexander, your sobering description of American politics had made me feel a little bit better about being trapped in our immaculate bubble within a bubble here in Perth, the farthest city on the planet on land away from Washington, D.C.
I was wondering if it would get an argument from you, but you probably agree.
No, I actually tend to, and again, this is why it's very useful to have your perspective from the UK. Having spent 25 years in Washington, having been born and raised in the US, I tend to be a little bit more bullish about the regenerative capabilities of the United States, having seen it time and time again. And I tend to be a little bit more skeptical about, what I've been somewhat derisively been calling small Britain rather than Great Britain post-Brexit. But the points that you've made are actually very encouraging. And I have to say, sitting here in Perth, we're in Australia's Indian Ocean capital, where we started the conversation, where you were talking about references to Thucydides and rising powers. And I tend to push back against the great power narrative because from an Australian perspective, we benefit from the rules-based order. We benefit from the international system of institutions, standards, norms, laws, agreements, organizations that constitute that system. And so you rightly pointed to some in the UK, and there's some in Washington too that would say the UK should remain focused on the Atlantic, as should France and Germany and Netherlands. And my view from here in Perth is no, the more the better. You know, the more we have, you know, France proclaiming its Indo-Pacific strategy, or Germany sending a frigate out here to visit Fremantle for the first time ever, or the UK sending aircraft carriers to this region, the better, because it emphasizes that this is not just about great power rivalry, or it's not a you know, a simple US-China issue. It's really about the systems, the norms, and the values. And the UK obviously has a really important role to play in that, and you've articulated that beautifully. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to, I mean, and I think this wouldn't apply to you, but I think with certain elements in Australia, so Australia's, the psychological relationship between Australia and the UK is quite interesting. You know, Australia was founded by the UK, was founded by Great Britain, and modern Australia, of course, is what I'm talking about, not the whole of the history of Australia. Modern Australia was founded by the British, and it's very British, Australia. When you travel the world, as I have done over many years, coming back to Australia, it's one of the things that's quite striking about it. It's much more than language, it's values and things. It's much more British than the United States is, and it's much more British than it is American. In terms of its attitudes and the way the way issues are debated and the values and things. I know you're an American, but well, it's not a question of better or worse. It's just different. And I thought that for many years. It strikes me that other than New Zealand, Australia is about the most British country that you could find. And then I found, as the foreign minister, in terms of common foreign policy issues, obviously with the UK, there are not many foreign policy issues we don't have in common as a function of geography. But it is, although their footprints are everywhere, British footprints are everywhere through the Pacific. You know, that the Union Jack is on the flag of Fiji, and it's on their flag for a reason. And when you go and visit Suva, I mean, there is now the presidential palace, I suppose it's called, the old government house, built by the British, and it's so sort of British as a building. So their footprints are everywhere. But the point I was going to make is, I don't think there is any country which instinctively on sort of international issues and a lot of other issues has more in common with Australia than the UK does. I mean, you can be standing in a room with, as I have done, with Brits and Americans and New Zealanders and the French and Indonesians and Japanese and so on. But the people we would instinctively have the most in common with would be the British. And I suppose it's not surprising, because whatever it is, I'm not sure what the figure is, it's something like 70% of the Australian population has heritage in the British Isles. And people say Ireland, but Ireland was part of the United Kingdom until 1922. So, you know.
So I wouldn't presume to have the kind of the breadth of the experience you have, but I would agree with almost everything you've said. But having now lived in Australia for almost 8 years and been a citizen just over a year and a half, I would look at it from the exact opposite position, right? I mean, looking at it from an American perspective, other than Canada, which again, Americans would say don't count because I think it's kind of 51st state, right? Australia is probably the most similar to the US in the world. And the same framing you just did from an American perspective, if you're in any room, the Australians are going to have more in common with the Americans than any other country in the world. And so that means that kind of positions Australia pretty well, right? If the Brits think we're most in common to them and the Americans think so too, that is why despite our
No, I don't
small
think that.
population,
Yeah,
we're central, right?
I wasn't referring to what the Brits think, though that is what the Brits would think.
Yeah.
I was just referring to my own experience.
No, understood. Yeah.
What I would find with the Americans is, yes, of course, we would have an enormous amount in common with the Americans, as you can see from our conversation here. Yeah. But one of the things that strikes me when I have a sister who is an American citizen. She lives in Austin or just outside of Austin. So I often go and stay with her. And so it's different from being in Washington, D.C. and meeting with the great and mighty. But just hanging around with her and her friends and playing golf at the local golf club and so on.
Well, Texas is a country unto itself. And so that's a whole nother conversation.
But I would say they were, what do I, yeah, a little different from Australians, more different than language indicates. Though here is a very interesting difference between the UK and Australia, and it's the two countries' attitudes to the United States. I mean, you know, they in the UK use an expression which Boris Johnson doesn't like, which goes back to Harold Macmillan's times, or even earlier perhaps, about the special relationship between the UK and the United States. I suppose that juxtaposes the UK to with other European countries. But I would say there is less affection for the United States in the UK than there is in Australia. In Australia, there is, the United States is very popular in Australia, and it is not as popular here in the UK. There is more skepticism. So all that stuff I was talking about, you know, Biden shuffling through his cards and trying to remember somebody's name. And I mean, it's a little bit embarrassing since it's the most powerful country in the world. He's supposed to be the leader of the free world. And before him, there was a guy who was just Delali as, you know, a TV frontman as the president of the United States with orange hair, and saying all sorts of crazy things, which, you know, rile people. Yeah, you know, people in the UK, in Australia, we just think, well, you know, these people come and go, and we've had our own rogues elected into positions of one kind or another. But I think in the UK, they think, well, that's the Americans for you. We would never do that. Actually, I think that's right in Australia's case. We would never elect someone like, but like Trump. We could elect somebody like Biden. Somebody who's 78 elected as the Prime Minister of Australia, having to stand up in Parliament and answer questions. How would he get on if he was subjected to our political system? Mind you, how would Ronald Reagan have got on and subjected to our political system?
Yeah, you might imagine that when I first arrived in Australia, and the first time I went to Parliament and watched Question Time, I was just shocked, because from an American perspective, there are few settings in which Americans can ever be considered to be polite, but our political discourse is one of those. And so it's quite a thing. Well, look, I could carry on this conversation for a long time.
Yeah, it's certainly not polite.
The start of your day in London, you're very kind to share your insights with us. We at the Perth US Asia Centre over the last 7.5 years have built a growing community, not just here in WA, but throughout Australia and the region. And we're looking forward to sharing this interview and your insights with them. And we look forward to engaging with you, and hope that Australia will eventually open up our bubble to let you back here with some greater frequency. And maybe the bubble within the bubble, we can get you to WA as well. So thanks.